Before I forget rather, we have a special event coming up next week. It's going to be on make sure I get the right dates here, July 15 to 17. So it's going to be at the Atlanta Intercontinental Hotel, and it's a discipleship event, and it's going to be each various sessions on the Book of Ephesians. So we're going to be kind of drilling down into the power of that great book. If you have any questions, just let me know. Or if you haven't signed up, by the way, to the Daily Growth email, I just want to make sure, because then you'd get announcements as required. So I really want you to use the Daily Growth email, because it's a shot in the arm. It's a very easy thing. It's like a mini Sabbath. How many of you are using the Daily Growth email? Just quite a few. Because what I like, so you go to the homepage at kenbo.org, and then just scroll down on that homepage, and then you can just find more. And it just gives you, on a daily basis, scripture, it gives you prayer, and it gives you as well some kind of word of encouragement. So, and then it also even a weekly verse to learn. And that, to me, is an email that you can keep open, or you can refer to it again and again. So that way you have a kind of like a mini Sabbath. You could do it for 30 seconds or 1 minute, you see. So it's a useful tool. Instead of just saying, what's a good verse, this provides things for you. So that's the reason why I want you to have that, because of the practical utility. How many of you are getting this? I'm just out of curiosity, the Reflections teaching letter. Only a handful of you. Oh, more than I thought. But again, that's a physical thing. And Dennis, you had some copies, I think, last week. But that's just a physical resource for you. That's a shot in the arm, a monthly shot in the arm. And it's really a pretty piece. It's attractive. It's an analog piece. It's one of those things that you can collect, and some people do. But it's simply something to encourage and equip and empower you on a monthly basis as well. And I mentioned that because that's where you get all announcements. Enough of all that now. We're back to the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're looking at an extraordinary book. This what you see here is actually the section from Talks of the Bible that I have. And it has, on every book of the Bible, then it actually provides an overview. So I thought I would use this just to illustrate this structure, that there's a basic thesis behind this book, that all is vanity, and then the proof that life is vain, and then the counsel ultimately is going to be, our counsel is to fear God. And so you have this whole description of vanity here, and the declaration. And then he demonstrates that, and then he gives, there's a lot of wisdom material that relates to it as the book proceeds. And so we have material on the introduction and title and so forth. But we talked about the difference between life under the sun and life under the sun. You see the obvious twist there. And the idea of life without the Son of God could be construed as vain, meaningless, purposeless, without a revelation from the living God. How do you really deal with the question of meaning? Is there a source of meaning? Is there some way of finding something that's going to be solid that I can hold on to? Because in this outline, you can see he builds upon this introduction, and in the first 11 verses makes this claim about the absurdity or the vanity of life. And so he speaks in generalities first. He doesn't wait very long before he says, the preacher, vanity of vanities, emptiness, meaningless, it's futile. It sounds so pessimistic. How can this book be in the Bible? You see, you wonder, but what we're going to see is it actually shows the grace of God, but it shows it from a silhouette's point of view, you see. It gives us a different orientation. But he asks the fundamental questions about work. When we go, a generation goes and a generation comes. The sun also rises, is actually how the King James puts that, which is what Hemingway got his title from, you see, which is a very clever term. The sun also rises, and what he's saying by saying that is that everything seems to go in cycles, in circles. There seems to be nothing new. Is there anything I can say is new? And he seems to despair because it's being written by a man who has access to great great resources. Intellectually, his acumen was astonishing. He was the wisest person other than Jesus Christ to walk on this planet, apparently, in terms of his capacities. And yet, how could this wisest of people become a fool later in his life and basically dissipate himself with money and power and pleasure? It's a really amazing thought. And indeed, he speaks about how things go in cycles and all things are wearisome. They just go around and around. And so that's his his claim, and then he uses illustrations to support that. And so then he proves it, he seeks from experience. So in the next portion, 112 to 226, you can see his exploration. I was king over Israel. And my view is that the most likely candidate is Solomon, for various reasons, because of his own descriptions of his accomplishments, none before him, because there were others who were there before the people of Israel took over Jerusalem. The Jebusites previously had it. So there were kings before him, there were kings after him, but there was no one like him. So there's good reason to think that. And you see, he's looking at this grievous task which is given to us, the works which I've accomplished. What was it? And he's not speaking out of sour grapes. The guy had such a wealth, such abundance. It was beyond imagination. He sought to increase wisdom more than all who were before him. So he had a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. He wanted to know madness and folly. He wanted to understand the way of this world. And so in our outline, then we talk about the vanity of striving after wisdom as an end in itself. It just actually leads in some ways to more misery. In some ways it's helpful, but in other ways it makes you more cynical, more negative, you see. So what's the purpose? What about pleasure? And he talks in chapter 2 about the acquisition of pleasure. And so I'm going to enjoy, I said, of laughter, its madness, because it didn't really do anything. And it was not as if he didn't try things, because the few years I could see, what good is there for the sons of men to do under heaven the few years of their lives? Then he tried works and accomplishments and acquisition and building, enterprises, vineyards and parks and ponds of water, slaves that he had in numerous amounts, flocks and herds, collected silver and gold and treasure, male and female singers, and the pleasures of men, many concubines. I mean, it's almost hard to conceive 300 wives and 700 porcupines. Concubines. What's he doing? What a dissipation. Just think about, even to give marginal note to these harems that he had would be a pretty full-time job. I'll let you process that. But when you consider this, all my eyes desired, I didn't refuse them at all. My heart was pleased. But yet it was not enough, you see, because it was still nothing to have. And so when we hear about famous people say, it's not all it's cracked up to be, we rarely listen. Let me try that first let me draw my own conclusions. Or wealth, you see, or any of these things. So what he's doing then in this exploration, he tries wisdom, he tries pleasure, he tries accomplishments, he tries labor. And says, what's the good of labor? It's going to be given to somebody else. And what will happen then? Someone else will own that. And so what's the futility, the dimension of how brief this earthbound sojourn really is? A thing comes to my mind here by way of an application here. Let me see if I can get it for you here. It's this image here that a person could become a nihilist, and the idea that there's nothing meaningful, there's nothing. Just look at the beginning of time, and from the end of time, you come for you're a cosmic blip. You're here for a moment, and then you're gone. You're 60, 80 years, 100 years, even 120 years is as nothing, because that time is just, again, just a blip in the universe. And so the idea would be, it's meaningless, but you can be courageous in spite of the futility. Nonsense. That's not a livable philosophy. So is your life an episode between two oblivions? Because without a biblical understanding, unless there is another life, This life at the end is just a birth, growth, decay, death, and this repeat. Stir and repeat, and every generation repeat and repeat. Why are we surprised at loss? Why are we surprised when our loved ones age and die? Why are we just surprised then when we ourselves do the same? And why is there such pain in that loss and such grief? Were we meant for something that's going to last? You see the concept here? We were meant for more than this world could ever begin to provide. And that, I think, is the point of the book in many ways, is to realize you and I were meant for more. And if I can get people to aspire and long for more, you see, to long for more than this world can provide. That's, again, goes back to my favorite sermon. And I don't know, how many of you have read The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis, that sermon? Some of you have. I have had to read it many times, and every time I read it, there's something new. But I imagine when it was first delivered in 1941 in the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, which is on the High Street in Oxford, and it's still very much as it was then. So I've been inside there. I imagine him delivering that sermon when he did, and whoop, they didn't get any of it. You couldn't get it. You have to read it again and again, because he's crafting a powerful story. But the more you learn about it, he says, if anything, our problem is we desire too little, not too much. Remember, he says, I want to enhance your desire, because our whole educational system is trying to drown out that quiet voice of great desire and longing for more. We all have an inconsolable secret that we long for more than anything this world can sustain. There is no power that's enough, no possession that's going to be big enough, no prestige, no popularity, no pursuit that we can think of in any aspect at all that it's enough, because you were meant for something that's transfinite and transtemporal. So therefore, any good on which you fix your heart that's not transfinite and transtemporal, in other words, not the wellspring of all things that are good and true and beautiful. If you give yourself and your heart to anything less than that, you're committing idolatry. You're worshiping the creation rather than the Creator. It's an impressive creation. We saw this glorious sunrise just before we took our exit, and the disk of the sun, and that wonderful optical illusion that is much bigger, but it's really not. But it gives you that illusion because of its proximity to the sun, but to the surface of the earth. But what glory, you see. We live and we're immersed in splendor. I appreciated your prayer that mentioned the beauty of the trees. You see, most people don't notice that. And I think when we see beauty like that, God says, I'm pleased that you noticed. But you see, unless you go beyond the beauty to the one who made it, it's not enough. Only God can fill that vacuum, that longing. I think that's what the book's about, essentially. So as we explore this book, then, we realize none of these things is going to be satisfactory. We can see that the surface on life, he's meant us for more, but then there's the inequities of oppression, insufficiencies of human religion, insufficiencies of wealth doesn't satisfy, there's no satisfaction in children even. At the end of the day, we're always going to be disappointed, you see, and it'll never be enough, you see. And at the end, you can't hold on to it. They're not going to be kids forever. There's this loss of certain goods that you had, and it'll never be the same. You know what I'm talking about. And I think all these things, even our aging, as you've heard me say, age conspires with God to transfer our hope from the temporal to the eternal. And so none of these things will satisfy. What's the counsel then? You have to coping in a dark world. To illustrate the idea of age conspiring with God, though, I can think of nothing better than chapter 12 of the book of Ecclesiastes, because here he's saying you do well to remember him while you have a chance, because after a while you'll lose and diminish your capacity. Remember in the days before the evil days come, Before the sun and the light, the moon and the stars are darkened. What happens? What is he talking about? He's talking about as your eyesight gets diminished, you see. And the clouds return after the rain, the day that the watchmen of the house tremble. So that your legs are now trembling, you see. You're beginning to shake. And the mighty men stoop, you see. You're beginning to lose that capacity. The grinding ones, your teeth stand idle because they're few, you see. And those who look through windows grow dim, again, the eyesight being diminished. And the doors in the street are shut as the sound of the grinding mill is low because you can't hear very well anymore. And yet, even when you can hear, the sound of the bird will wake you up. So it's a strange thought. The daughters of song will sing softly. You don't have the capacity. Furthermore, men are afraid of a high place. They're afraid of terrors on the road. They get weaker. The almond tree blossoms. That means your hair is going gray. That's the image of the almond tree. And the grasshopper drags himself along. You can just see that the legs are just dragging behind you. And the caperberry is ineffective. The caperberry was an aphrodisiac. That too doesn't work, you see. So at the end, it's a pretty pathetic picture of the decline of the human condition. It's beautiful poetry, but it's pretty depressing when you see about it. And then he says, for man goes to his eternal home, while mourners go about in the street. Fascinating image, isn't it? The idea, remember him before the silver cord is broken. I wonder about this metaphors. The silver cord, what is that? The golden bowl is crushed. The pitcher by the well is shattered, and the wheel at the cistern is crushed. It seems to me that he's talking about the separation of the soul from the body. You see, when at the point of death, that connection, that link is finally split. And now the body is inanimate, you see. Remember him before that happens. Then the dust will return to the earth as it was, and the spirit will return to God who gave it. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. But then he speaks about the wisdom, though, because he says the conclusion at the end of the day is this: fear God and keep his commandments. He's not denying the existence of God. He's just showing the weakness, the absurdity of a world without God. That's where I believe he's trying to do with us. So that's why I think that there's an inspiration in this book that is important. My friend Barry Morrow, some of you may have known Barry. Did any of you know Barry Morrow? Yes. Yes, you knew him, yeah. He wrote a book on heaven. Now he's there. It'd be interesting to hear his comparison the moment he stood before Jesus. But my view is that at the point where the spirit, where the soul is separated from the body, you see, because your spirit is already in the presence of Jesus, but your soul is going to lose that link. The golden bowl will be crushed, the pitcher will be broken, that bond will be lost. And then at that point then, what's your next sight? I do think it's of Jesus. I think it's the Bema. I think it's the judgment seat. And the Bema of Christ is going to be where he then reviews your life probably in a moment of time. Yet I've had those experiences. Have you ever had dilated time where you saw your whole life together in one time? I've had 5 of those. Near-death, out of my 16 near-death experiences, 5 involved that, where it was the most bizarre experience where you actually go through your whole life and you see these things. I wonder, I don't know what that Bema is going to be like, but everything's going to be dealt with. And we'll see it from his point of view for the first time. And that's a sobering thought, to see sin as God saw it. You see, and to see the sin of unused potential, I don't know. There will be weeping, but there will be reward. It's a judgment seat. It's not condemnation. But if you build on your superstructure, and it has components that are built out of wood, hay, and straw, but also gold, silver, and precious things, those things then will be set afire, and that which endures, you receive a reward. Live that way. But that's the whole concept then. We stand before him, and then everything is dealt with. And Barry I discovered very recently this proposal. I didn't even know that he had written. Somehow it was a proposal that Barry wrote for a book on Ecclesiastes, A Seeker's Guide for Meaning and Happiness in Life. And he uses this quote from Oscar Wilde: there are two tragedies in life. One is not getting what you want, the other is getting it. Anyone who does not see the vanity of life must be very vain indeed. So, and he had a great wit about this, and he discusses this book, but he talks about how it's concerned with the question of meaninglessness and how prosperity gospel preachers do not have the real brutal honesty. He says in the book of Ecclesiastes, it's under the sun. There's no faith flashbulb attached to its camera to reveal the inner depths and mysteries of life. So there's, apart from God, it's giving the best human wisdom can come up with, and it's a brutal and spiritual honesty about this book. He's an explorer, starkly honest. In fact, he says that Ecclesiastes led the God-haunted agnostic Herman Melville to declare in his classic Moby Dick that the truest of all books is Ecclesiastes, because it fits, if you're honest, the real condition. We have a values system loss, as he wrote in this proposal. We know more about everything and less about everything. You see, the everything being with a capital E. We have more facts and knowledge, but there seems to be a diminished apprehension of the purposes of God because of the diversions of life. And he uses the Peggy Lee song, "Is That All There Is?" And so it raises that question. I've told you before, for some people, life is like a kind of a haunting back and forth play between two songs. Is that, or I did it my way, Frank Sinatra. And then she says, "Is that all there is?" Then he did it my way again. That didn't work. Back and forth. Because you'll find that apart from God, those quests are always dead ends. But rarely do we believe it when others who have attained those goods say it's not all it was cracked up to be. I don't believe it. So instead, we continue to pursue meaninglessness and vanity when we've been warned in Scripture about this. So it's an inspired monologue. As Barry put it, and I thought this was helpful, Ecclesiastes is the question to which the rest of the Bible is the answer. You see, that's not a bad insight. And as he said in this inspired monologue, it's a divine revelation precisely because it is the absence of that. While in the book of Job, because God speaks, he has everything, even though he has nothing. In the book of Ecclesiastes, because God is silent, the preacher has nothing, even though he has everything. So it's a very good insight. The concept then is that it's like a silhouette for the rest of the Bible. We cannot be too thankful for the great atheists because they show us the shape of God by his absence more starkly than believers do by his presence. Very interesting insight, isn't it? So what are we talking about then? How can we recover lost information, lost insights? Because it's got to be conveyed generation to generation, or there's not going to be much of a hope. And so he says this message is fundamentally this, that without faith in a God that's larger than life, and therefore worth dying for, and consequently worth living for, without a faith that means trust and hope and love, then life is a vanity of vanities, you see. So notice this. He's not just worth dying for, he's worth living for, you see. And you have to ask, what am I giving my life in exchange for this very day? Because no life can be led in some kind of neutrality. A choice is always made. And you're either moving closer to or further from that one we're called to know and become like, you see. So really, every day is an invitation. And that we look in this world, and as he says, well, apart from a living relationship with God, life becomes tragic and futile because death trumps even the most celebrated life. You see, you can't get around it. So we said, it's like the guy who was buried in, he had, I think, very bad taste. He loved his gold-plated luxury car, so he gave instructions that to be buried in his car with a big cigar in his mouth, you see, and a nice, really fine suit. And as they're lowering him into the grave, somebody wistfully says, "Man, that's living." I think something was missed there. I don't know what happened there. But the whole idea is understanding the word, understanding how we are to live, and to grasp once again this notion that we are called to have a certain way of living. That we are people, we are men who are called to prove ourselves to be blameless and innocent, children of God above reproach. That's your character in this time. We live in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation, and if that was true in first century Rome, how much more so in our own time? In many ways, there's been a powerful declension because the human condition has been amplified by technologies, so that it actually amplifies the problem and makes it even more profound than it was before. The children are having opportunities to be exposed to things that no adults even were seeing in the past. So the whole concept then is, unless there is a grasp of what's going on in this world, we're going to miss our calling. But we've got to understand the world and understand the culture. That's important. But understand your calling is too. You are called to be a light in the world. And it's the light that dispels the darkness. The darkness not comprehensive. So the way you dispel error is by truth. You see, you use truth to replace error. You use light to overcome the darkness. You use love to overcome then the wickedness of this world. So there's this idea, you're a light in the world. You hold fast the word of life, so in the day of Christ, that's the coming of Christ, I may have caused the glory. So when I think about this book, then I think about these fundamental issues of life, and it gives me a way of seeing and asking these questions again. Three that I'm giving to you for your consideration. The first one is, how can we be honest about the ambiguities of life without being cynical? You see, it's after you look more closely at it, you can get a kind of a cynical mindset. You see, you can look at the seamy, dark side of things and wonder, is there any real hope? So how can you and I be brutally honest, but at the same time walk in hope and faith and love? But you need to understand the time and not just be having your head in the sand. How do most people live without wrestling with the big questions? And we have to ask that question. How is it that people, through indifference and distraction, are capable of avoiding the basic questions of who am I, where did I come from, why am I here, and where am I going? For decades sometimes. It amazes me. The only time that they may have to ask that question was when they're forced to, against their will, when they go to a cemetery, or when they go to a service, a memorial service. Then they're forced. They have no choice. It's someone they knew. They can't escape. He's now not here. What do I do about that? If you're thinking at all, you know it's not going to be long before you're in that same condition. We actually act as if death is something that might happen to the other man, but not with me. It's amazing to me how we exclude ourselves from that inevitability. How is it possible? Why are people not God-haunted, meaning-haunted? Why do they repress that? What is our culture telling us how we can, through indifference and distraction, avoid even thinking about those great questions of life? It's a remarkable thought. And then third, what do we learn from the inevitable process of aging? Because in my view, there's a grace involved. It's a terrible thing, but it's also, without it, we would not be in a position to take what God is saying very seriously. That God conspires, again, in this way. We have no choice. You see it around you. It's because of its gradual perception that it becomes so, sneaks up on you. So imagine you've got a mirror and you see, and every 10 seconds is a year. That'd be an interesting mirror. Make it even shorter. Every second is a year. And to see that obvious decline, you know, so we can kid ourselves. You're looking pretty good, aren't you, today? You look terrible. And so when you go to a meeting, it's always been fascinating. Oh, you haven't aged a day. You ever hear people say after 10 years? Nonsense. I want to say you big liar, but nonsense. I look terrible and so do you. I mean, I don't want to say that, but at the end of the day, let's be honest, we're not getting better looking, you see. We're not getting stronger. We are declining, we're diminishing, and unless you take that seriously as a divine invitation to reflect, you're going to live a life of trivial pursuit. Well, we'll see what you think with your questions. How did you answer these questions? What was the most interesting or stimulating thing that you came across this morning? Anyone have something to share, some insight that you came up with at one of the tables? No insights. What? Back there.
The first question, not to be honest about the ambiguities of life without becoming cynical.
Yeah.
We've established that you have a decision to either deny or accept Christ, and your lifestyle goes one way or the other. It's not a reasoned, factual decision. It is a moral decision to be either moral, virtuous, or to be immoral. So that whatever direction you go, one will provide you cynical.
Yes.
Or give you, shall we say, a good, honest view of your situation, and you realize that without God, without the Lord in your life, you cannot have life. You have to be that when you become honest. But you cannot live your life without the Lord.
Yes. Yes. Otherwise, you're right, because you're living on the surface of life and you become cynical about human nature, about people. The more adept you become, the more you look in that manner. Yes.
Is Ecclesiastes a balanced book? Because he's dealing with that problem, I think you choose to be cynical because of the quote-unquote pleasures of life, which takes you down the river, shall we say, versus your moral decision to be virtuous.
Mm-hmm.
Is it balanced?
Yeah, he plays off both sides. This is good, but don't overdo it. This is so he looks at both sides, and he wrestles with and embraces a measure of ambiguity in this fallen world. But to your point earlier, though, when I've been thinking about the whole idea of excellence, I've been chewing on that idea, and I now have seen that true excellence is inside out. Although most people are focusing on functional excellence, you see, but then without the inner heart dimension of, because in my view, it is in fact the spiritual that animates or should energize the moral. So it's an inside-out process. And when that occurs then, the moral virtue, you see, Christ-likeness, that then makes us the kind of person who is other-centered rather than self-centered, a person that is considering the needs of others more than themselves because it is born out of an inner quality of life. And thus, the functional excellence should be an expression of the others. But most time, people focus on functional excellence and their relational failures. Many men are functionally excellent, but don't have any skill when it comes to relationships at all. And so, because they're able to get by on that, and the accolades of the world reward attendance, buildings, and budgets. It also rewards those external things, you see. It awards success as the world defines it. And we try to quantify success, but the metrics of this world are not the metrics of the kingdom of God. Because the metrics of the kingdom of God are relationships, and you can't quantify them. You cannot quantify. I don't have a relationometer. So I can't measure. So we're called to live in a measure of ambiguity. But if you are living from the inside out and not from the outside in, that to me is, and that's really what I think. So I think Ecclesiastes effectively offsets the rest of Scripture by giving what a hard perspective would be like if there was no God. But he says, but I'm able to go into that dark quest because I know there is one, you see. So I'm able to penetrate that. Instead of the person who says, I will courageously embrace the absurdity of life, you see. not, people suppose, of this firm foundation, as it was put by Bertrand Russell, that he believed that he's building his life on a firm foundation of unyielding despair. How's that working for you? You see? So your own thing, here's what happens then. Atheism, or anything that's non-theistic, is eroded by the acids of its own assumptions. You see what I'm saying? It's toxic to itself. It's not livable. It's toxic. And it's too thin a broth to sustain a robust aspiration for something more than this world can provide. So what the scriptures are doing is they're inviting us to come back in, to come to the heart's desire, and to see what that would look like. And so I'm reminded of the weight of glory here when Lewis speaks about this. Remember, again, as I've told you before, if we consider the unblushing promises of reward and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. Then there's this famous statement, we're half-hearted creatures, fooling about with drink and sex and ambition. He says that's nothing. That's childlikeness. It's childishness, rather. It's trivial pursuit. When he says infinite joy is offered us, like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea, we're far too easily pleased. And so in this wonderful sermon that I alluded to earlier, then we have these great statements. If we are made for heaven, the desire for our proper place will already be in us, but not yet attached to the true object, and will even appear to be the rival of that object, you see. So you might suppose that what God's offering to us is not quite what I had in mind, you see. And so you might want to return the offer. But yet at the same time, we have this desire. And he says, we cannot tell it because it's a desire for something that has never actually appeared in our experience. When you think of those moments of longing, of awesome moments of beauty and goodness and truth, he then goes on to say, but if the books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trusted them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And he says that what came through them was longing. These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, are good images of what we really desire, but if they're mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the heart of their worshippers. They're not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we've never yet visited. It's kind of magical, isn't it? And so he says, almost our whole education has been directed to silencing this shy, persistent inner voice off almost all our modern philosophies. I see this as a typo in this PDF here, modem. Philosophies have been devised to convince us that the good of man is to be found on earth. Nonsense. At the end, he is saying that we are going to, that the glory that God is offering us, that one day to please God, to be a real ingredient in a divine happiness, to be loved by God, not merely pitied, but delighted in as an artist delights in his work, or a father in his son. It seems impossible, a weight or burden of glory which our thoughts can hardly sustain, but so it is. It's going to be all that and more. You haven't seen anything yet.